Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 676 for January 14th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
A lot of the buildings that we're working on are Prohibition-era buildings. And one of the things that we always find in every single construction is whiskey bottles, usually in the ceiling. So, these guys were really putting them down while they were building these buildings, and they would, just afterwards destroy the evidence by throwing it into the ceiling that they had just built or underneath the floorboards and then building over it.
Want to get a piece of whiskey history? It might just be easier than you think. Greg Trainor is a bourbon drinker, a lot like you, but he founded the Philadelphia Community Corps and PhillyReclaim.com to help clear up abandoned houses and buildings, while also providing job training to people interested in entering the construction industry. The thing is, while he and his crews have been salvaging pieces from old buildings, they've also been finding all sorts of stuff from the Prohibition-era. Not just old bottles, but prescriptions for medicinal whiskey and much more. Depending on where you live, there might just be a treasure trove of whiskey history just like it near you. I'll have more with Greg Trainor later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also look at some of the places that should be on a whiskey lover's travel bucket list. And I'll also have the calendar of events, this week's Your Voice, and the What I'm Tasting This Week department, all coming up on this week's WhiskyCast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique. But a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. Another new distillery fired up its still for the first time this week. Lux Row Distillers in Bardstown, Kentucky started making whiskey the other day and has been sharing photos on its social media feeds. The distillery is owned by St. Louis-based Luxco, and its whiskey will eventually replace the sourced whiskey that's used in Luxco's Rebel Yell, Ezra Brooks, David Nicholson, and Blood Oath brands. The distillery will eventually be open for tours, but work continues on that part of the project. Also out of bourbon country, the owners of Michter's Distillery in Louisville have purchased a 145-acre plot of farmland in Springfield, Kentucky. It's about 15 miles east of Bardstown in Washington County, and the initial plans are to start building the first rickhouse on the site later this year. But Michter's president, Joe Magliocco, said in a news release that they could also use some of that land to grow their own grain as well. The purchase price was not disclosed. One more notable honoree on Queen Elizabeth's New Year's honors list. Professor Martin Tangney of Edinburgh Napier University was named an honorary officer of the Order of the British Empire for his work in turning distillery waste products into biofuel. We missed him in going through the list because his honor was for services to engineering and energy, and also because he's a native of Cork, Ireland. His honor is, honorary. The UK's Foreign Office selects non-British citizens to recommend for honors on a separate list. His Celtic Renewables firm has received approval to build a demonstration-scale plant in Grangemouth, Scotland, to prove the commercial viability of biobutanol, which can be used in place of both gasoline and diesel fuels. From the dishonor roll now, it looks like a ruling could come in April on whether former White & Mackay owner Vijay Mallya will be extradited back to India to face fraud and money laundering charges. The drinks business reports a British magistrate has given Mallya's lawyers more time to prepare their case against the Indian government's extradition request, Malya's bail has been extended until April 2nd. He hightailed it out of India in April of 2016, just hours before police tried to serve an arrest warrant on him, and he's been living at his estate outside of London. Malya is accused of skipping out on more than £1 billion of debt from the collapse of Kingfisher Airlines in 2012. India's Supreme Court has also ruled him in contempt for failing to reveal his assets worldwide. Diageo is also trying to claw back $40 million from Malya's severance package when he was forced out of United Spirits in 2016, along with millions of dollars it claims Malya took from United Spirits to prop up other parts of his failing empire, including his Force India Formula One team. I'm not sure whether to call this story a sign of the coming apocalypse or not, but we're about to see the combination of a celebrity whiskey and an IPO on the stock market. Canadian music superstar Drake and spirits entrepreneur Brent Hocking announced this week that they're going to take their Virginia Black whiskey brand public. They're hoping to raise $30 million through a public stock offering later this spring. The whiskey came out in 2016 and is sourced from MGP in Indiana. According to the announcement, that $30 million will be used to fund expansion, sales, and marketing for the brand. In other words, they are not building a distillery. The Chinese New Year is coming up later this month, and we're already seeing commemorative bottlings on the market. The Macallan has released a special 2-bottle pack of its 12-year-old double cask single malt with special labeling. The package is $130 each. And Johnny Walker is out with its annual release of Johnny Walker Blue Label with a special bottle for the Year of the Dog. It's a 1-liter bottle that will be available only at travel retail outlets for about £175. That's around $240 a bottle. And Johnny Walker has also expanded its experimental Blenders batch range with a new travel retail exclusive. This one is a sherry cask finished version that uses malts from Blair Athol, Cardew, Strathmill, and other distilleries. It'll sell for about $44 for a 1-liter bottle. Old Pulteney is also expanding its travel retail lineup with 2 new single malts. The 2006 vintage is an 11-year-old malt matured in ex-bourbon casks and bottled at 46% ABV. It'll sell for around £55, $75 a bottle. There's also a 2002 single cask bottling that's matured in ex-bourbon barrels. It'll be exclusive to the Swedish travel retail market. It's bottled at 58.2% ABV and will sell for around 1,300 kroner. That's $161 a bottle. Also, the Old Pulteney 1990 vintage that came out last year as an exclusive at Heathrow Airport in London will now be available globally in travel retail. It sells for £288. That's around $395 a bottle. And we must close out the news on a sad note this week. Carl Reevey was not born on Islay, but he was one of those people who defined Islay's character. Friendly, passionate, and completely devoted to the island and its people. He spent the last 5 years as Brooke Laddie's PR person. Before that, he was the editor of the Iliac, Islay's newspaper of record. And before that, in 1995, he and his wife Jan bought and restored the Port Charlotte Hotel before they sold it in 2003. Carl died suddenly this past Monday at the age of 61. Our condolences go out to Jan, their son Alistair, and all of Carl's friends on the island. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. We're also on Apple News and Google News, too. And the news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. Look for Highland Park's new The Dark 17-year-old single malt at a whiskey shop near you. And find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
You can listen to WhiskyCast almost anywhere, and now that includes anywhere you can connect to Spotify. You'll find us in the podcasts section of Spotify. And if you have Amazon's Alexa around the house, just tell her to play the latest WhiskyCast. Next time around, I'll be in Victoria, British Columbia for our annual show from the Victoria Whiskey Festival. Join us for results of this year's Canadian Whiskey Awards, interviews, and a whole lot more on the next episode of WhiskyCast. Let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice. It's brought to you by Lot 40. Had an email this week from longtime listener Justin Victor, and he has a question that I've been trying to answer myself for a long time now. Hi, Mark. My local whiskey club is interested in purchasing lanyards for a Glencairn glass. I'm sure you've seen them at the whiskey festivals. Do you know of a source we can contact to see about purchasing these? Any leads you might have would be greatly appreciated. I'm very familiar with those lanyards. I even have a couple of them. And if you haven't seen them, they're like a badge or a credential holder, but they have a snap-on elastic strap that fits perfectly around a Glencairn glass. Now, I have no idea who makes them, but I would like to find out too. Because if we can find a source, I'd like to have some WhiskyCast lanyards made up. So I'm going to open this up to our community. If you know of a source for these lanyards, please email me at comments@whiskycast.com, and I'll pass the details on to Justin. As I've mentioned before, I spend some time each week answering whiskey questions on Quora.com, and that is spelled Quora. The other day, someone asked, why should I consider going to the Scotch Whisky Experience tourist attraction? It's located on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, at the base of Edinburgh Castle, and has gone through a complete revamping in recent years, which we've covered here on WhiskyCast. My answer on Quora was that it really depends on one's general level of knowledge about Scotch whisky. Newcomers will get a solid grounding in the basics without any brand-specific influence, especially if they're not going to be visiting a distillery on their trip. But even for those with a lot of knowledge about Scotch, it's worth going to see the exhibit of around 3,500 or so historical whiskey bottles that were collected by Clive Vidies over the years. That collection is now part of the experience. And the upstairs whiskey bar at the end of the tour has a lot of rare drams at relatively reasonable prices. There's also a nice restaurant and whiskey bar on the ground floor, too, and a really good whiskey shop. Now, my answer to that question also went up on our Facebook page, and Tim Matthews responded, yeah, it's a bit touristy, but you have to take it as that. If you know a bit about whiskey, it is nothing new. However, bear with it and just get to the bar and get your wallet out. A very decent selection at a reasonable price. Yes, it's more than pub prices, but paying £5 for a shot for a few quality old drams is certainly worth it. Just don't overdo it, because the shop is on the way out, and after a few it becomes far too easy to open the wallet. And Mark Zinzio II seconded that. The whiskey shop there is worth a look. They have the biggest selection of mini bottles to sample that I've ever come across. Thanks, guys. And here's one more question, this time from Twitter. @Yersot, YERSSOT, retweeted a photo of a whiskey vending machine in Osaka, Japan from Dan Castellano at ninja_Padrino, and Yersot wanted to know where he could find it on his next trip to Osaka. The vending machine had minis of Suntory's Hibiki 17-year-old blend, along with the 12-year-old Yamazaki and Hakushu single malts. Now, I have no idea, since I've never been to Osaka, but someone else asked Dan Castellano directly, and he responded, it's in the lobby of the Astil Dotonbori Capsule Hotel in Osaka. By the way, those minis are not cheap. The 12-year-olds are 1,000 yen, around $9 each, and the Hibiki 17 is 1,500 yen, that's $13.50 US. But at least you're not paying bar prices. Those could be a lot higher, and the vending machines are open 24 hours a day. If you have a question, a suggestion, or anything else to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast, and my email address is comments@whiskycast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Our friends at Reserve 101 in Houston, Texas are celebrating their 10th anniversary with a party this Thursday night, January 18th. McTeers has its first whiskey auction of the year on Friday, the 19th in Glasgow, Scotland, and the National Whiskey Festival is the next day in Glasgow as well. The Whiskey Shop in San Francisco has an Aberlour tasting on Saturday the 20th. There's a Port Ellen tasting at the Morin Center in Quebec City, Quebec on January 25th, along with a whole bunch of Burns Night events around the world that night. The Buffalo Whiskey Fest is January 28th in Buffalo, New York, and the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society's U.S. chapter has a Burns on the Beach celebration January 31st in Miami, Florida. Bonham's has its first whiskey auction of the year February 2nd in Hong Kong. The Whiskey, Wine, and Wildlife Weekend is February 8th through the 11th in Jekyll Island, Georgia, and the Zagreb Whiskey Fair is February 9th and 10th in Zagreb, Croatia. Right now, we have 205 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have a whiskey festival or a tasting coming up, use the contact form on our website and let us know all about it.
You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. But when you have a special occasion, why not celebrate with a specially engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label? Here's how one whiskey lover celebrated his team's recent success. He arranged to have 108 specially engraved bottles of Johnnie Walker Blue Label made for his co-workers. You might say he hit a home run. Just like a perfectly executed double play, Johnnie Walker Blue Label is smooth and well-rounded, and unlike a trophy, never needs polishing. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnnywalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. In just a few minutes, we'll go scavenging for whiskey history with Greg Trainor of the Philadelphia Community Corps. But first, if you're making your plans now for a spirited vacation in 2018, there are plenty of places to choose from. This week, Photoers.com gave us a list of 11 different spirits experiences with a heavy emphasis on whiskey. Kelly Magyarics wrote the story for Photoers.
With all the craft distillers popping up, I think distillation just seems more approachable. Like it's something that people think that they could try or they want to learn more about it. Same thing with mixology and cocktail classes. And so, just going to a distillery and kind of belling up to the bar and getting a taste of gin or whiskey isn't enough for some people. So I found some places that are either places where you can go and work alongside the distiller for a day, and you can really learn about mash bills and learn about fermentation and distillation. Then places where you can mix your own cocktails and learn about how the spirits that a distillery produces will actually go with certain ingredients and what cocktails they're best suited for. And then some other kind of quirky ones like, learning how to, or kind of sitting there and bottling with the distiller or dipping your own bottle. So there's lots of experiences that are out there that are just go beyond just tasting the spirits at a distillery.
This has really sort of exploded in recent years because the distilleries that were offering tours used to basically just do quick basic tour into the tasting room for 2 or 3 little small pours and then off to the gift shop and out with you.
Absolutely.
And they've really evolved into an experience now.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I think a little bit about like places like Jim Beam Urban Stillhouse and just Louisville in general. So that urban bourbon trail that they have there is just exploding, and there are lots of places that are either already open or opening that are right there in the city, so you don't even have to go out into bourbon country anymore. You can do all these fun things and have these cool experiences right there in, for example, the city of Louisville. So that's great too.
What was the most unusual one that you found so far? Or at least that would be something that is off the beaten path a little bit that somebody really would gain a lot from?
Well, I think a couple stand out for sure. The Ginstitute. I think staying in a hotel it's the world's first hotel that's dedicated to gin. So, and then staying there, being able to take a class, being able to mix and blend your own gin and pick your own botanicals and that kind of thing. I think that's really unique for sure. So gin lovers who find themselves in England, I think that's a must try destination, and I definitely need to make it there. That just opened within the last year, I believe. So, and then I think some of the other, having the chance to stay alongside a distiller for the whole day or 6 hours at places like Wiggly Bridge. So they do a Distiller for a Day program. It's held 4 times per year, only 4 participants. So it's definitely a chance for you to work all groups. You can ask questions. You can really get a hands-on experience with the whole process from grain to glass. So I think if you're really into spirits and really into learning more about distillation and having a hands-on process, that's a great experience. Sells out quickly, though. So
I think we need a whiskey hotel dedicated exclusively to whiskeys.
Yeah. Absolutely. So if you were going to do that, where would you put it? Would you put it in an expected place like, in Kentucky, or would you do it in Scotland? Where would you put it? I don't know.
I'd have a chain. Scotland, Ireland, Kentucky, Canada, Japan, global domination.
That would be a great idea. I think we've just come across a great business plan. We'll have to work on that.
Now, we've got some other places that are going to be opening up in the next year or so, things like that massive new Macallan Distillery and Visitor Center in Scotland, and some more experiences that are going to be really coming online, not just in Scotland, but in Kentucky and Bourbon country and all over the place. Mm-hmm. Why do you think people have jumped on this so much?
Well, again, I think it's because just the popularity of and the explosion of craft distilleries, for sure. I think it just makes it all seem accessible. And whether or not you're going to a really big producer, a huge one like Jameson or like Macallan, or you're going to a smaller one like Wiggly Bridge or Catoctin Creek, I think that just the whole process of distilling and making spirits just seems more approachable these days because there are so many brands out there and so many smaller producers, and people really want to be a part of that. And for sure, if you're a wine lover, you want to go to the winery during harvest and you want to see that and you want to see fermentation. So if you're a spirits fan, you want to see more. And I think there's more of like kind of a magic and a science and an alchemy to distillation. And I think some of these programs really kind of make it more accessible and let you to kind of peek behind the curtain, so to speak. So I think that's why there's just so many of them, so many opportunities, and it's great. It's never been a better time to be a spirits fan and to travel, for sure.
So what didn't make the list? What runner-ups were close that could have made the list, but you only had room for 11? Or the editors only let you have 11?
Exactly, yeah. So there is, on Barbados, Mount Gay. I mean, who doesn't want to go to the Caribbean and drink rum, right? So Mount Gay makes the oldest existing brand of rum in the world. They have a surviving D from 1703. They regularly offer a cocktail workshop with transportation, which is fantastic. So you don't have to worry about getting there and getting back. So you learn about the rum's history and the craftsmanship, and it's linked to sailing, which is obviously visible on that label, over a rum punch, and then you taste their signature spirits, and you do not only a cocktail class, but it's like a cocktail competition with the rest of the people in the class. So I think that's super fun. And then there are things that are a little bit, not just for a day, but you can also do things like Princess Cruises is having a culinary cruise coming up. This is their third offering, but they're doing things like a seminar on jerk chicken with rum pairing, and they're doing a cocktail class, mixology class, and there are other cruise lines that are doing things like that. So, and that's for sure a more immersive experience because you're not just there for a day or an afternoon. It's more of a time commitment. So those were a couple things that I found that, again, didn't make the cut for either space reasons or just because they didn't exactly fit the rest of it. So lots of things out there, and I'm sure you've come across others as well.
Yeah, but tell me about your best experience at one of these places.
I did I think Catoctin Creek, and that's in my backyard, is here in Purcellville, Virginia. I love Scott and Becky. Just going to their bottling workshops, which are held monthly. Just super fun, very laid back. You go, you have donuts, you talk with them, and you can do anything from run the whiskey cow, which is the one that's super popular that everybody wants to do, which is the one that actually fills the bottles, to filling the boxes, to capping and sealing. And what's nice is if you want to buy any of their spirits or the spirits they're bottling that day for a gift, you can follow it all the way from step one all the way to the end and then sign it and give that for a gift or buy it yourself. So that was just fun because it's really approachable, and I feel like you don't see too many bottling workshops where we're able to take part in that. I did also like going to Maker's Mark and dipping my own bottle because that's just such an iconic packaging. So I think that was fun too. But a lot of these that are on this list I have yet to go to, so I'm super excited to hit some of them. I think the Gin Institute is number one on my list, and then any of the Scotland ones as well. But I want to stay in that hotel and I want to make my own gin.
By the way, the next bottling workshop at Catoctin Creek is set for March 17th. And we do list those on the calendar of events at whiskycast.com. Now, this coming December marks the 85th anniversary of the end of Prohibition in the U.S. with the ratification of the 21st Amendment back in 1933. That 13-year period turned a lot of Americans into criminals in the eyes of the law, and some of them were pretty good at hiding their evidence. We know that because we're still finding it 85 years later, hidden away in the nooks and crannies of old houses and buildings. For Christmas, my family gave me an original prescription form for Prohibition-era medicinal whiskey, along with an empty bottle of Peter Dawson's Old Curio Scotch whiskey. They did not find those artifacts on eBay, but in a warehouse on Philadelphia's East Side. Greg Trainor founded the Philadelphia Community Corps and Philly Reclaim with two goals in mind: clean up the city's abandoned houses and buildings and train people for construction jobs. The programs are funded by selling the salvaged building materials and other stuff they find in the buildings they're tearing down. And these days, they're finding a lot of whiskey-related artifacts from the Prohibition era. This weekend, I went back to the Philly Reclaim warehouse to talk with Greg Trainor and see more of what they've found.
So we get projects all the time to do what we call a pre-demolition salvage. So this is before the demolition has taken place. We're going to go into the building and save everything that we can that is the architectural features and heritage of the city. So that can be doors, windows, mantelpieces, tile, cabinets, all sorts of stuff. And then we usually work with the demolition contractors following up on that to save all of the building's structural components, the bricks, the lumber, the flooring, the roof decking, everything, all the way down to the ground. We're going to save all of the building's materials that are coming out in a reusable condition. The owner for this, basically for donating their building, gets a very large tax deduction for all of these building materials that they're donating to us. And they support our costs of coming out and putting a lot of job trainings on the project, essentially turning the project into like a temporary, their project into like a temporary job training facility, where we're teaching guys about buildings and construction by taking apart their building.
And it helps really save a lot of the heritage of a city. When you do this, I know there are a lot of other cities that do this, have projects like this as well, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, but Philadelphia is way behind the curve on this. So other cities like Baltimore is really big on this. Pittsburgh's been doing this for a long time. New York has deconstruction and reuse nonprofits. And all these formerly industrial cities have job training programs teaching people to go out and salvage buildings before it all ends up in a landfill, as well as large central building material reuse centers where even other contractors, developers, and do-it-yourself renovators can drop off their salvage building materials from their own project to keep it all out of the landfill and then see it go back into the local economy and create more jobs.
You find some pretty cool stuff when you're doing this, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, we found all sorts of stuff. You know, when I started this organization, what I had in mind was more like bricks and lumber. And we've got that, our lumber, we've got huge piles of lumber and brick that are for sale at the warehouse. But what I kind of never anticipated was the amount of architectural antiques and historical artifacts that we find in every project that we do. I mean, every single one, even the ones that we walked through the first time and we're like, well, there's nothing much interesting here. We'll just get the flooring and the lumber and the bricks. We still end up, when we're taking up flooring or pulling out mantelpieces, stuff is falling out of the walls or hidden away in nooks and crannies in the attic spaces or under the floorboards. And there are relics from our past that tell a story. It's really interesting. It's kind of my favorite part of the job sometimes, to be the first person in sometimes hundreds of over 100 years going into a space and finding what the people who built those buildings left behind.
And let's get to the Prohibition side of things, because there were a lot of distilleries in Philadelphia before Prohibition. Not so many afterwards, but this city was awash in booze during Prohibition, as you have found 85 years later, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the buildings that we're working on are Prohibition-era buildings. And one of the things that we always find in every single construction is whiskey bottles usually in the ceiling. So, these guys were really putting them down while they were building these buildings, and they would, I guess, just afterwards destroy the evidence by throwing it into the ceiling that they had just built or underneath the floorboards and then building over it. So, when we're taking the buildings apart, we're always finding these old cork-bottled whiskey bottles hidden away there. And then, sometimes some other stuff, like on the most recent project where we found these bottles that were labeled rye flavor and gin flavor for, if you had some sort of, I guess it was for if you had some sort of like moonshine or something like that, you could flavor it, your homemade liquor, so that it would taste like the real thing.
And I think that's what the bootleggers would have used to sort of take their bathtub gin that they were making and try to pass it off as something closer with these flavorings. But you've also found, well, we're looking here at a box full of old Overholt whiskey bottles and boxes. Tell me what's in this box and tell me the story behind this stuff. And we'll put pictures of this up on our website and Facebook page.
Well, it was pretty funny because we're working on this house in South Philly, and it's a big house, a nice house. And one of the older members of the community came over and started regaling me with, tales about the neighborhood and who had lived here when, and their stories. And, that happens pretty often when we're taking the buildings down, is that somebody who's been in that community for a long time wants to tell us about, the family that was there before and other people and stuff like that, and all the neighborhood stories, which is always fun. But she was telling us, she was like, oh, there's gold in that house. I'm telling you, he was a gold hoarder. And I just kind of laughed it off, didn't think anything about it. And then as we were taking apart a built-in cabinet to salvage it, beautiful built-in cabinet with cedar paneling on the inside. We always want to save stuff like that. We noticed there was a hidden hatch built into the back of it with hinges on it, these strap hinges that opened up, and behind it, so when we saw that, we moved the whole cabinet away from the wall and found that the wall was actually, an artificial wall that had been built off of the original wall. There was a terracotta wall that was hidden behind that cabinet, and then there was an entrance through the terracotta wall, and then it went to like a sort of 2-foot crawl space that went all the way back behind the wall. And then there in the floor, there was another hole that went down, and there was a little stash of old antiques underneath the floorboards in this hole. And it was so funny because as I'm finding all these hidden compartments and fake walls and stuff like that, and finding one layer after one layer, I was like, oh my God, that lady was right. Like, I was thinking I was going to find a stash of something. But looked inside, and there was a lot of whiskey bottles. There was an old pitcher in there, which is really nice and has some cool detail on it. And some boots, which I'm not usually used to seeing, is boots in the floor. I was thinking, like, is this like an old prank between construction workers? Is that somebody hid somebody's boots underneath the floor or something like that? And then the rye flavor and the gin flavor bottles were in this little stash spot underneath the floor.
And we're looking at a couple of old Overholt boxes that are still in really good shape. Labels here. These flavoring bottles that you've talked about. And tell me about these boots, because I think I may know some of the story behind these boots.
Well, like I said, my first theory was like, what? They didn't look like they were worn out or anything like that. So I was like, why are these hidden like this? I thought, maybe somebody like stole somebody's boots as a joke, hid them away, forgot about them or something. I don't know. And but I started looking at them. They seem to have like some sort of like holes in the bottom for cleats in the heel and the sole of the boots. So I was looking at that and I wasn't really sure. But I've heard some theories since then that these may have been boots that Prohibition-era bootleggers would use to sort of hide their tracks.
Right, because the reading we've done indicates that what they would do with those cleats and the holes in the shoes would be to put things like horseshoes on them or animal tracks or something like that to try to throw off the trail if there was a Prohibition agent looking around in the snow. Because we'd get a lot of snow in Philadelphia in the winter that followed the tracks and find the hidden compartment. But if they see a horseshoes or animal tracks, they're not going to find that, and they're not going to find those hidden compartments, and that's how they'd attach them to the boots, I think.
Right, yeah, I'd actually seen that. I used to have a history professor who was at Temple who was a consultant with Boardwalk Empire, and I remember him telling us about that, and I think they featured that on the show at one point, that they would like use cow hoofs. And they would attach these to the bottom of their boots, and it was, it'd be like all the people would be walking around with these little attachments on their feet when they were going through fields to change the whiskey shipments over from one truck to the next truck, or something like that to hide their boots.
What else have you found whiskey related over the years? You've never found a full bottle yet, have you?
No, not any full bottles. Nothing I'd want to drink. Nothing that looked like it was sealed well enough that you would still think that it's drinkable whiskey or anything like that. Like I said, we found a lot of bottles on almost all of our projects. We find old bottles in the ceiling, hidden away, and we try to save those. We have a ton of bottles here in the store at Philly Reclaim, and then we had in a chest, in a dresser that someone donated to us. We went and we cleared out a lady's garage. She was donating a whole bunch of old furniture to us, and inside this chest were just scraps and scraps of paper, and she wasn't sure what they all were, but we just took it away. And when we got it back to the warehouse and started looking at these scraps, they were prescriptions for medical alcohol. Just like we have medical marijuana nowadays, this is back in the era where alcohol was illegal, but if you knew a pharmacist and had the money for it, you could get a prescription and to get your medical alcohol for your anxiety or your nerves or whatever they wanted to call it. So there's prescriptions for this much alcohol or that much alcohol in there. They also had IRS regulation books for the shipments and policies for opium and cocaine as well in the same box with these alcohol prescriptions for how to prescribe or buy legally opium and cocaine and prescribe your alcohol. So it's just really a different era. And I think one of the interesting things about that was we work with job trainees who are many times returning from incarceration or on probation. And most of them are nonviolent offenders who have gone to jail and gone to jail when they were teenagers, sometimes 16, 17 years old, for dealing weed. And now they're coming out of jail, 20 years old, their life severely damaged by their incarceration and trying to rebuild their lives and get back on track for weed. Something that's about to be legal everywhere. It's becoming legal state by state all across the country. It is the future and progress that is inevitable. And it's just like the end of the Prohibition era. And it's just like a sort of flashback to a time when, alcohol could be used to arrest a bunch of Irish immigrants or Italian immigrants because that's how they were being treated. And history has repeated itself once again. With a failing war on drugs and the use of marijuana incarcerations to oppress certain people, So I think it's important to remember this history and for people to learn about, what we've done before and so that we can hopefully never make these mistakes again.
What did the guys that were working on this think when they came across these rules for legally prescribing opium and cocaine? And these guys had just gotten out of prison for marijuana, for crying out loud.
Well, at first, a lot of them didn't know that stuff was ever either illegal, like they didn't know the whole history behind it, so a lot of them didn't know, which tells you something about our public education system in this country, is that many of them didn't know the history of the Prohibition era for alcohol, or that opium and cocaine used to be legal and prescribed by doctors over the counter and be actually included in a lot of other products that were sold.
Like Coca-Cola, for instance.
Coca-Cola, yeah, it had cocaine in it. So exactly, yeah, they didn't know the whole history about that, so we had a little history lesson there, which is, I think, actually one of the really fun things about doing this is a lot of times is telling guys the history about things while we're taking them apart. But afterwards, they absolutely made that connection, and there's a certain amount of I wouldn't call it bitterness, but they're like, it's something that they knew. It's something that they didn't know the history of it, but they know what marijuana arrests are used to do, which is to keep them down, to oppress them, to target them, to pull them aside, to arrest somebody when people want them to be arrested. They need something, so they go after them for, having weed on them. Meanwhile, a college student would never be arrested for that, So they recognized the hypocrisy in it, absolutely. But it was something that they didn't know the history about it, but they knew what's been happening in their communities, and they recognized it.
What's the lesson here for collectors of whiskey memorabilia? As near as I can tell, the lesson is look anywhere, because you don't know where this stuff is going to turn up.
Yeah, I would say it's all around us all the time, especially in old cities like Philadelphia. If you've never, I wouldn't go prying up all your old floorboards because I like keeping buildings preserved, but it's probably under your floors, in your ceilings, in your walls, the bottles and matchboxes and whatever else from construction workers who built your house in the 1910s, 1920s. The whole time they're leaving little sort of hints about their story and their past and their experiences building things behind.
And go find a reclaim site in your area and look for this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're finding this stuff yourself and you want to save it, you can always bring it by here as a donation and get a tax deduction, or swap it for some store credit. And, or if you're a collector yourself, you can come on down here, and we have a variety of old bottles that are pharmaceutical antiques or alcohol, old whiskey bottles and stuff like that, Scotch bottles. We got it all down here, so come check it out if you're someone who appreciates that sort of history.
While we're talking about this one program in Philadelphia, keep in mind that many cities have similar salvage and recycling programs for building materials, and they might just have some whiskey artifacts mixed in with the old doors, mantels, floorboards, and other stuff. If you're interested in your own whiskey treasure hunt, it never hurts to look. And remember that box of stuff that Greg and I talked about? The one with the old Overholt boxes and bottles of flavorings and other stuff? Well, we bought the whole box and took it home. And with an hour or two of research, it turns out that house on Bainbridge Street in Philly was probably home to a small-scale bootlegging business. There were 2 full bottles of Ben Burke 4-in-1 rye flavoring and a full bottle of 4-in-1 gin flavoring, along with 1 glass bottle labeled Calamus 1-10, with a thick layer of syrup still on the bottom, and recipe sheets showing how to use those ingredients to take a gallon of legally prescribed medicinal whiskey and, by mixing them with water, stretch it to make 5 gallons of bootleg whiskey. Looks like someone in that house was getting the old Overholt prescribed for them, then turning a nice profit by diluting it for sale on the black market. Now, the stuff probably wouldn't kill you, but it is worth noting that calamus root is known as a tranquilizer and sedative and has been banned since 1970 in the U.S. as an additive in food and drinks because of its links to cancer. And acerone, which is one of the compounds in calamus root, is toxic in high amounts. Needless to say, we are not going to test out that recipe, but you'll find photos of all of the stuff on our Facebook page and at whiskycast.com. And there's one other note, too. The Ben Burke who produced those 4-in-1 flavorings, according to longtime whiskey historian Mike Veach, It was founded in Boston by Irwin Benjamin and H.C. Berkowitz, hence the name Ben Burke. After Prohibition ended, the market for those 4-in-1 flavorings pretty well dried up. Benjamin and Berkowitz went on to make connoisseur cordials, fruit-flavored syrups for mixing home cocktails, along with a dry gin. They needed a new name, though, and settled on Mr. Boston. Yes, the same Mr. Boston of Cocktail Guide fame. It's now part of Sazerac, which recently released the Mr. Boston Drinks app for today's cocktail fans. As the old song from A Chorus Line goes, everything old is new again. And that's this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the whiskey bootleggers tried to emulate during Prohibition. But there's no substitute for the real thing. Fortunately, you don't have to settle for a cheap imitation today. Look for the Lagavulin 16-year-old single malt, the Lagavulin Distillers Edition, and the new Lagavulin 8-year-old at a whiskey shop near you. And learn more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I tasted a lot of whiskeys this week, trying to clear out some of the backlog on my tasting table. Let's start off with the Deanston 12-year-old single malt scotch. It's bottled at 46.3% ABV, and the nose has a good maltiness with notes of orange marmalade, straw, and a hint of roasted almonds. The taste is fruity and floral with hints of black tea and lemon, honey, dried flowers, and touches of oak and almonds. The finish lingers with a nice fruitiness and hints of caramel candy. I'm scoring the Deanston 12-year-old a 90. Next up, the Ballantyne's Glentalker's 15-year-old from the new Ballantyne's Single Malt series. This one is bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has tropical fruits, dried flowers, heather, honey, a slight nuttiness, and just a hint of vanilla. The taste is fruity and sweet with brown sugar, orange marmalade, fresh berries, and a hint of honey. And the finish is long and mouth-watering with tropical fruits. I wish they'd bottle more from Glentalker's as a single malt. I'm scoring the Ballantyne's Glentalker's 15-year-old a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute. But first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Whiskey Advocate's 2017 Whiskey of the Year, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. The 12-year-old barrel proof bourbon was pitted blind against competition from around the globe, and it was consistently ranked number 1 by the magazine's testers. Meet the whole Elijah Craig family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Now, let's look at the latest release from Enoch. Peat Heart is Knockdhu Distillery's most heavily peated single malt to date, with a phenol level of 40 parts per million. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is smoky and slightly medicinal with touches of smoked salmon, heather, charred oak, vanilla, and honey. The taste starts off fruity with pineapple and orange blossom notes, and then the peatiness kicks in. It turns smoky with grilled fruits, honey, and vanilla. And the finish is medium length and smoky with touches of those grilled fruits. I'm scoring the Enoch Peat Heart a 91. Finally, I received a sample of Highland Park's The Dark on Friday, and you can see a short video of the box opening on our social media timelines just for fun. This is 17 years old, sherry cask matured, and bottled at 52.9% ABV. The nose has notes of Christmas cake, orange marmalade, apricots, toffee, and a touch of figs. The taste is luscious and complex with orange marmalade, apricots, figs, toffee, and touches of white pepper, ginger, and clove spices, along with just the barest whiff of peat smoke in the background. The finish comes to you courtesy of the law firm of Long, Long, and Long. It fades very slowly, with touches of orange pekoe tea, lingering spices, and just a hint of licorice. I'm scoring Highland Park's The Dark a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And I've added these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,000 whiskeys, 2,060 to be exact, at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD video episodes, along with the latest whiskey news, events, cocktail recipes, and much more, including a complete archive of past episodes. Thanks to all of you who have taken the time recently to post ratings and reviews for WhiskyCast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast sites. And if you haven't posted your review yet, I hope you'll take a minute this week to do it. Those ratings and reviews are figured into the search results that do help other whiskey lovers discover WhiskyCast when they're looking for podcasts. Of course, you can always find me during the week on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique, but a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnnywalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.